a very well-known name, Dr. Chandra Grover. She is a professor of dermatology and STD, UCMS. She is a member of several scientific organizations, to name a few. The founder secretary of the Nail Society of India. She is assistant editor, IGDVL. She is the organizing secretary for the third ISND. She was the organizing secretary, I beg your pardon. She is a member of the SIG Dermatosurgery. Her main area of interest is nail disorders, pediatric dermatology, infantile hemangioma. And so I invite Dr. Chandra Grover for this interesting talk on what's new in dermatology and STD.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Thanks to the organizers for having me here. And yes, an anticipated session. I hope I live up to the expectations. Brigadier Arora has set the tone for this session by saying that you should be ready for future shock therapy. And if I was just asked, okay, so what's new? What are you presenting? I said, everything is new. It's a difficult job to actually choose what to talk about and what to leave about. This is, I welcome you all to this biannual newspaper of our Cuticons. For those who are keen to know the cutting edge, there are going to be news and there are going to be some views, so some amount of filtering on my part has been applied. That is why I want to start with this disclaimer that it is impossible to cover what all is there within this first 5 months of 2016, leave alone the rest of the literature of dermatology. And I have aimed to cover what could be very useful for day-to-day practice of most of us. I'm not covering these key topics, which are covered in so many other sessions lined up for the day. Pigmented lasers and moisturizers we've already had, and the other topics also we are going to be covering up, because if you would have seen, the whole program has been very brilliantly designed to cover what's new throughout the whole day. Starting with acne and related disorders are bread and butter. And we had this interesting study about the efficacy and safety of 7.5% Dapsone once daily application gel, which was tested in moderate grade 3 acne. And it was found that there was a higher reduction in the mean counts of inflammatory, non-inflammatory, as well as total lesions versus the vehicle. And so the authors go on to say that this could be a very safe and well-tolerated treatment, especially important in the scenario of rising drug resistance. Then there is this study of isotretinoin use for acne vulgaris, which is associated with increased serum uric acid levels. It has been well known that isotretinoin use or vitamin A use can lead to increased serum uric acid, but this is one aspect which most of us are not testing on a routine basis. This study of 51 adults with severe acne went on to show that serum uric acid levels were significantly higher at the end of first and second month of therapy, and this could probably be related to long-term complications in the form of renal disease, hypertension, or atherosclerosis. So one aspect that we should start looking into. Another study commenting on the laboratory monitoring being done during isotretinoin therapy for acne, something which we do day in and day out. And this interesting meta-analysis, including trials using more than 40 milligram per day of isotretinoin for a period of more than 4 weeks, found that isotretinoin was associated with statistically significant changes in lipid levels, hepatic functions, as well as CBC. But at the same time, the trial says that the proportion of patients with lab abnormalities is low. So we have to actually look at how many patients and how long do we need to keep on evaluating for abnormalities in these aspects. Another interesting study of presenile diffuse familial sebaceous hyperplasia, successfully treated with low-dose isotretinoin. This entity has been described as extensive yellowish papules with central amplification, which was treated in this study with low-dose isotretinoin. So 2 cases have been mentioned which are successfully managed with 0.2 milligram per kilogram per day of isotretinoin. Even after discontinuation, there has been no recurrence. But the authors go on to say that the literature existing is not that supportive, so unified treatment protocols are probably needed. These are the 2 cases which have been shown by the authors. Coming to another common entity, atopic dermatitis. An analysis of the caregiver reported and self-reported data on more than 2 million children and adolescents from US National Health Survey showed that anemia is significantly correlated with atopic disorders. Now, this is again one aspect which we need to keep on looking while we are managing our atopic children as well as adults. The incidence of anemia was found to be much higher when all the 4 atopic disorders were present in the same patient, and this could be both due to chronic inflammation, anemia of chronic disease, or due to malnutrition because of numerous dietary restrictions imposed on the patients. Another agent, dupilumab, in patients, adults with moderate to severe atopic dermatitis, has been evaluated in phase 2b trials. These are industry-sponsored randomized controlled trial with chronic moderate to severe atopic dermatitis, showing that there was a greater improvement in the eczema area severity index at 16 weeks. So we have an additional arrow in our armamentarium against the problem of adult onset atopic dermatitis, adult atopic dermatitis. Coming to infections, the center stage is taken by scabies, and we had this very interesting study from Fiji, in which 3 islands were divided for 3 kinds of mass drug administration protocols to bring down the incidence of scabies. First approach being single dose ivermectin to the whole of the population, second dose being topical permethrin to whole of the population, and the third being the standard treatment which we follow here, that is treatment of the person and the contacts. And what was shown was that the decline in prevalence at 12 months of scabies in the 3 islands was much more with single dose ivermectin, which is again a very implementable strategy. Scabies also joins the list of WHO neglected tropical diseases. In fact, it is a neglected tropical disease which has been now recognized to have a morbidity risk much higher than the several other tropical neglected diseases included in the WHO list. The numerous complications and associations have been recognized, and we have increasing focus on this new drug, moxidectin, as a new oral treatment for human scabies. Now, moxidectin is a drug which is well established in veterinarian practice for ectoparasites. The advantage with this drug being that injectable, oral, as well as liquid formulations are available. And a single 0.3 milligram per kilogram dose is supposed to be effective. What we can learn from this study is that it's a promising new drug, but with trials for clinical efficacy, with known clinical efficacy, but we need trials for clinical efficacy compared to the existing treatment modalities, dose optimization schedules, and the pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic profiles need to be studied. We also need data with respect to the safety in younger children, pregnancy, and lactation. Coming to pediatric dermatology, what I'm covering here is mostly infantile hemangiomas. It has been now, the study shows us that Face syndrome, we know how to manage the cutaneous component and to look for the underlying abnormalities. But this study shows the long-term risk of aortic arch abnormalities and the complex surgical repair which is needed and even the risk of recurrence thereafter. So from this study we learned that extensive aortic arch reconstruction may be required for a number of cases with Face syndrome. The complete pre-op imaging is needed to fully characterize the complex arterial anomalies which need to be reconstructed, and even then the risk of recurrence is high. This study tracks the anatomical patterns of infantile hemangiomas of extremities, and it says that the infantile hemangiomas on the extremities are localizing corresponding to the supply areas of embryonic arterial variants. Now, this gives us important clues to the onset of these lesions because a temporary regional to the variant anatomical structure during early fetal development may stimulate the proliferation of hemangioma stem cells. This may be the reason why these lesions are existing. Another study of ulcerated infantile hemangiomas treated with atenolol. Now, we know that propranolol has taken over the center stage with respect to treatment of infantile hemangiomas, but it's a non-selective beta blocker. This study reports the author's experience with atenolol, which is a selective beta-1 blocker. So it has been proposed to be equally effective, but with less side effects. So for 45 patients, this retrospective analysis showed that atenolol administered at an initial dose of 0.5 milligram per kilogram per day and raised to 1 milligram per kilogram per day was quite effective for ulcerated lesions, and very less side effects were noted. Now, coming to psoriasis and other papilloscomus disorders, apremilast, which is an oral phosphodiesterase 4 inhibitor, was being evaluated in the treatment of moderate to severe psoriasis, and this study shows the effect in nail and scalp psoriasis. Because nail and scalp involvement is common, and we may not be having too many drugs to be able to target them, this study shows that apremilast given at 30 milligram BD versus placebo produced a clinically significant improvement in nail as well as in scalp disease, and this is apart from the improvement being produced in the severe plaque psoriasis. Similarly, we have this newer drug, alitretinoin, in severe oral lichen planus, and this one is a prospective pilot study which shows that alitretinoin 30 milligram once daily may be useful in oral erosive lichen planus, which has been unresponsive to other forms of therapy. Skin cancer, we have most of the research focused on various forms of skin cancer, and non-melanoma skin cancers are the commonest cancers being responsible for morbidity as well as mortality worldwide. This particular study in mycosis fungoides patients retrospectively divided them into two groups of long survivors and the dead patients, and analyzed their biopsy specimens for HLA ligands for killer cell immunoglobulin-like receptors. The analysis showed that HLA-BW6 specificity was increased among the dead patients, whereas BW4 was more specifically associated with long-term survivors. So now we recognize a few HLA markers which may prognosticate the patients of mycosis fungoides. Another newer drug, brentuximab, which has been used for CD30 positive large cell, anaplastic large cell lymphomas, is now being tracked, and the second malignancy was tracked. So they reported that with nicotinamide, fewer tumors were reported as compared to the placebo group. Mind you, all these patients were immunocompetent, and nicotinamide was found to be safe and effective with no particular adverse drug reaction risk. Now, this interesting tumor, the Merkel cell carcinoma, this is now being increasingly recognized all over the world. Merkel cell carcinoma is a rare aggressive neuroectodermal skin cancer with a high recurrence and a high mortality. And the known risk factors include advanced age, UV exposure, Caucasian skin, and immunosuppression. This population-based data study, retrospective study from the Swedish Cancer Registry, shows that there were 606 cases of Merkel cell carcinoma over a period from 1993 to 2012. And this increase was actually amounted to an increase of 73% over these years. The most common primary site was head and neck. 90% had no lymphatic spread, and only 2.9% had confirmed distant metastasis. So this is a new form of malignancy which we need to recognize and be aware of the possibility of its occurrence. Coming to the favorite malignancy, melanoma, a lot of research is focused on melanoma. I deliberately kept less reports in this particular session because we don't encounter it that much, though we are increasingly becoming aware of many new manifestations. Advanced stage melanoma is largely considered untreatable, but it has been now found out that small molecular inhibitors of melanoma oncogene, BRAF, can offer hope by activating the immune system. But the downside here is that not every patient may respond, which may be due to variable degree of cancer heterogeneity, which enables selective outgrowth of treatment-resistant tumor clones in certain patients. We don't know the risk factors. Coming to urticaria and angioedema, again something which we encounter on a daily basis. Is there an association between restless leg syndrome and urticaria? This study goes on to say, yes, there is a distinct possibility. Both disorders are associated with sleep disturbances, and the authors evaluated 30 patients with chronic simple urticaria and 100 healthy controls. And they found that the frequency of restless leg syndrome and sleep disturbances were significantly higher than controls. And both the disorders may actually share a common etiology. Cholinergic urticaria may be associated with anaphylaxis. This is what this report tries to emphasize. Cholinergic urticaria is a physical urticaria, and the precipitants of cholinergic urticaria are very capable of precipitating even anaphylactic reactions. So in this largest series of 19 patients with cholinergic urticaria who developed episodes of anaphylaxis over a prolonged follow-up period, it was found that 79% of them were females, and the diagnosis of the reason for anaphylaxis was again and again delayed because clinicians were looking for other causes. So the study emphasizes that clinicians should be aware that cholinergic urticaria can have significant systemic symptoms. Vibratory urticaria, another form of physical urticaria, is now recognized to have a hereditary component. It is autosomal dominant, and this could be related to the gain-of-function mutation in the gene ADGRE2. This receptor encodes cell surface receptors, which are normally inhibitory for mast cells, but this gain-of-function mutation leads to susceptibility to degranulation of mast cells. And with the study in this particular disease subset, the receptor may actually be pointing us towards a component of innate immune response to noxious physical stimuli. Coming to adverse drug reactions, all of us know that we are playing a pharmaceutical roulette all the time. We do not know which of our patients is going to react to which drug. And in these 6 months, we've had interesting cases of drug reactions being reported. First of all, the phosphodiesterase, the anti-programmed DEATH1 inhibitors, monoclonal antibodies, have been found to be very useful in the scenario of cancer treatment, but they have been associated with reports of bullous lichen planus-like reaction. The histology in these cases has LP-like changes, but negative immunofluorescence. Acquired perforating dermatosis have been associated with sorafenib therapy, a drug which is used for metastatic renal and hepatocellular carcinoma. And the skin manifestations of this toxicity with sorafenib are quite heterogeneous. The particular toxicity being reported in this paper are the various kinds of acquired perforating dermatosis. The important thing here is that both perforating folliculitis and elastosis perforans serpiginosa morphology have been reported. The authors go on to report several mechanisms, and they also propose that the simultaneous occurrence of perforating folliculitis and elastosis perforans serpiginosa supports the concept that acquired perforating dermatosis is also a continuous spectrum of disease. We have this report of photoallergic contact dermatitis due to treatment of pulmonary fibrosis with pirfenidone, which is a new drug for pulmonary fibrosis. This is a drug with antifibrotic, anti-inflammatory capabilities. The phototoxic potential had been recognized for this drug earlier on, even before marketing, but the possibility of a photoallergic contact dermatitis is summarized in this paper, in which 2 elderly patients with a typical photoallergic rash, which improved with drug withdrawal, are described. Then we come to our favorite topic of DRESS, we have 2 interesting studies tracking their patients with DRESS over a prolonged study period. This particular study shows that among 132 patients with cutaneous adverse drug reactions in patients, they have recognized that a substantial number of patients had a maculopapular exanthem with few systemic symptoms, not fulfilling the criteria for probable DRESS. And this they have designated as maculopapular exanthem DR subset. They go on to say that this subset is as common as DRESS, with no significant difference in gender, age, or concomitant disease. Allopurinol is the main culprit for DRESS in this series, and antimicrobials for the maculopapular exanthem. The paper goes on to hypothesize that there may be a continuous spectrum between just a maculopapular exanthem to the MPDR rash to proper full-blown DRESS syndrome. The latency was significantly longer for MPDR as compared to the maculopapular exanthem. Facial edema is a significant feature in favor of the rash being an overlap or a DRESS syndrome. This study from Thailand tracks 52 patients with DRESS over a 10-year period, out of which they report that 71.2% were female. Again, a female preponderance is seen. The common drugs in their scenario are the anticonvulsants, as are common in our setup. The other drugs are nevirapine, allopurinol, and cotrimoxazole. The median onset time, according to this study, is approximately 16 days, and up to half of the patients had to be given systemic corticosteroids to facilitate recovery. The study also says that allopurinol-induced DRESS has the longest onset time, associated with higher eosinophilia and incidence of renal involvement.
Dr. Grover, can you please make it faster?
Yeah, sure. Vemurafenib is a drug which is used in malignant melanoma, and it has been found to produce grade 3 to 4 skin toxicity in a substantial number of patients. This study says that dabrafenib is a good option in these cases. Most of us would agree with this scoring system of internal medicine and dermatology. This particular study says that subclinical atherosclerosis is significantly associated with recurrent after stomatitis as reflected by the CIMT levels in most of these patients. We have this new disease being described in the form of phosphodiosis disease, which could be an undiagnosed, underdiagnosed adverse event of laser hair removal. The disease has clinical and histological features very typical of phosphodiosis disease with minor variation. 308 nanometer excimer light therapy has been found useful in alopecia universalis, resistant to other forms of therapy. The authors say that the good response is associated with strong pigmentation in most of these cases. Coming to biologic therapies, we are now closer to identifying through genome-wide association studies possible reasons for why anti-TNF alpha therapy does not work uniformly as good in psoriasis patients. And these are the associations which have been found. We have this interesting report in IJDWell about the use of ustekinumab in severe psoriasis with chronic hepatitis B. Normally this is a contraindication, but the authors didn't have much of choice here. And they found that over a period of 39 months, no worsening has happened. In fact, psoriasis has improved. Coming to treatment of striae distensae, we have this interesting review article in JEADV, which goes on to give a flowchart kind of approach to the use of topical therapies for prevention as well as treatment of striae distensae. It says that the evidence in favor of prophylactin and alpha-steroid creams is good for prophylactic use. Rest of the evidence is of very poor quality. Coming to diagnostics, we have this dermoscopic study again from Indian authors for pseudofolliculitis of the beard area, which shows typical signs in the form of handlebar sign, white areas, and linear bluish pigmentation. Now, this most interesting study published in the BJD says that a new PCR assay is capable of diagnosing the presence of dermatophytes and even species identification in paraffin-embedded biopsies. This is an important hurdle which we are now overcoming. Now, what's new in STD? Of course, Hillary Clinton's campaign is new, and we have new sets of guidelines. And in the UK National Guidelines for Management of Syphilis, these are found most useful. I'll just be briefly reading the important recommendations. In asymptomatic disease, there is no need for full routine examination or chest X-ray. Procaine penicillin has been taken up as the alternative wherever benzathine is not suitable, is suitable. Resistance to macrolides is something which is big news in syphilis, and recommended duration of therapy for neurosyphilis is now 14 days. Among the non-penicillin antibiotics, doxycycline has been found to be effective and erythromycin least effective. We have less studies as compared to other drugs. Azithromycin treatment failure has been linked to intrinsic macrolide resistance in some strains of Treponema pallidum. I'll be giving some details right now. It has been also said that cardiovascular and neurological disease may progress in cases despite adequate treatment. Again, some representative cases I'll show. We have new set of guidelines for neurosyphilis as well as for pregnancy, the key feature being a formulation of a birth plan for patients who have not been treated adequately during pregnancy. Drug failure, this is big news in the field of STD. And we have this failure of Maraviroc and darunavir, ritonavir once-a-day combination in preventing progression of neurological involvement in HIV. And we have this failure of azithromycin and macrolides in syphilis, where the resistance has been linked to the presence of A2059G mutation. Now this report is from China and another report is from Cuba, so this is supposed to be very extensively prevalent. We have few interesting cases also being reported over the years. 2 cases of oligosymptomatic neurosyphilis in immunocompetent patients where they had been adequately treated 15 years back for syphilis with tracking done for a period of 2 weeks, no reinfection, but again development of neurosyphilis. So it is being increasingly recognized that benzathine penicillin may not be able to prevent progression to neurosyphilis. The risk profiles are being assessed in view of such reports, and various risk factors for progression to neurosyphilis in HIV-negative immunocompetent patients are being worked out. We have these 2 interesting reports from All India Institute of Medical Sciences. One is this report of a non-healing genital herpes mimicking donovanosis in an immunocompetent patient again, and another one, penile carcinoma presenting as an inguinal bubo, again in an otherwise immunocompetent patient. Among the epidemiological studies,
I think you have 1 more minute, please.
Yes, sir.